I'm worth not much, sir, but I can cook. Those words would change everything, but first they had to survive the laughter. Picture this. A woman standing on an auction platform in 1880s Wyoming, wearing a faded dress and carrying nothing but hope, while an entire town decides she's worthless. One man sees different. One choice defies everyone. One moment proves that love doesn't start with beauty. It starts with courage. This is the story of the bride nobody wanted and the rancher who chose her anyway. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The autumn sun hung merciless over Red Creek, Wyoming, baking the frontier town until the wooden buildings seemed to groan with exhaustion. Dust devils spun down the main street, and the air tasted like dried grass and distant promises that never quite arrived. It was the kind of day that made men irritable and women retreat to whatever shade they could find, fanning themselves with folded newspapers and wondering why they'd ever left civilization behind. But today, the heat didn't keep people indoors. Today was auction day. The crowd gathered in the town square, clustered around a makeshift platform constructed from rough-hewn timber that still smelled of pine sap. Men in worn work shirts and sun-damaged hats stood with arms crossed, evaluating. Women in their Sunday dresses whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes sharp with judgment. Children darted between legs, sensing entertainment even if they didn't understand the mechanics of what was about to unfold. This wasn't a cattle auction. This was something the town dressed up in prettier language but couldn't quite disguise for what it truly was. A mail-order bride arrival, where women who'd traveled from the east under promises of marriage and new beginnings were presented to the men who'd paid for their passage. Some called it opportunity. Others called it necessity. A few, in quieter moments, called it desperation on both sides. 3 women had arrived on the morning stage, and 2 had already been claimed. Sarah Mitchell, young and blonde with a practiced smile, had stepped down to immediate applause and been whisked away by a mine owner whose advertisement had promised wealth and security. Eleanor Price, a widow with sad eyes but good teeth, had been collected by a shopkeeper who needed help with his store and his 4-year-old daughter. Now only one remained. Mara Leland stood at the edge of the platform, her fingers clutching a worn leather satchel that contained everything she owned in the world. Her dress had once been blue, a deep, rich blue that had cost her 3 months of wages when she'd bought it in Philadelphia 2 years ago. Now it was sun-faded to something closer to gray, patched at the elbows and let out at the seams more than once. Her boots were cracked across the toes, the kind of wear that spoke of miles walked rather than miles ridden. She was 26 years old, though the sun and hard work had carved lines around her eyes that added years to her appearance. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple bun, practical rather than fashionable. Her face wasn't the kind that launched ships or inspired poetry. It was the kind that men's gazes slid past on their way to something more compelling. The auctioneer, a portly man named Silas Mensch, who ran the general store, cleared his throat and gestured for Mara to step forward. She did, her movements careful, as if she were walking on ice that might crack beneath her at any moment. "Gentlemen," Silas announced, his voice carrying across the square with practiced authority. "This here is Miss Mara Leland, recently arrived from Philadelphia. She's seeking a husband willing to provide a home in exchange for honest work and companionship." Crowd murmured. Someone in the back laughed. Not cruelly exactly, but not kindly either. The kind of laugh that said, "This ought to be interesting." Silas consulted a piece of paper. "Miss Leland has submitted the following statement. I'm worth not much, sir, but I can cook, and I don't quit." The murmuring grew louder. More laughter rippled through the assembly. "Not much to look at, neither," a voice called out. Mara's cheeks colored, but she kept her eyes forward, her chin up. She'd known this would be hard. She'd prepared herself for hard. Hard was familiar territory. "Can she bear children?" someone else asked. A rancher named Dutch Holloway, whose wife had died in childbirth 3 years prior, taking the baby with her. Silas looked uncomfortable. "I don't have information on that particular—" "I can work," Mara said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I can cook, clean, mend, tend animals, help with planting and harvest. I've worked in factories and kitchens and laundries. I don't need pretty clothes or fancy things. I just need a chance." The crowd fell silent for a moment, absorbing this. Then Dutch Holloway shook his head and turned away. Others followed his lead, conversation resuming in clusters as men discussed whether the remaining work back at their properties was worth abandoning this entertainment. "No bids?" Silas asked, his showmanship faltering. This was awkward. The other women had been claimed so quickly.
"Gentlemen, Miss Leland has traveled a long way. Should have stayed in Philadelphia," someone muttered. Mara felt something inside her begin to crack. Not break, because she'd been broken before, and this wasn't quite that, but crack nonetheless. Like ice in spring, the first sign that everything solid beneath you might be about to give way. She'd spent the last of her money on the train ticket west. She had 17 cents in her pocket and nowhere to sleep tonight if this didn't work out. The boarding house wouldn't take her without payment, and she'd already learned that frontier charity had limits. Behind her shame, though, beneath the humiliation, a small flame of anger began to kindle. She'd survived a drunk father who'd used his fists more than his words. She'd survived factory work that broke women's backs and spirits. She'd survived Jasper Crane. That was the thing she didn't let herself think about, the memory she kept locked behind iron doors in her mind. And she would survive this too. "I can cook," she said again, louder this time. "I made bread that folks lined up to buy. I can make $1 stretch to $2. I can work 16 hours and still get up the next day. What I can't do is make myself prettier or younger or whatever it is you're all looking for. But if any man here needs someone who won't quit when things get hard, I'm standing right here." The silence that followed was different. Not thoughtful exactly, but less dismissive. One or two men shifted their weight, reconsidering. Then a woman's voice cut through the quiet, sharp, cultured, dripping with false sweetness. "Oh, how inspiring! A woman who can make bread. Surely that's worth a lifetime commitment." Mara turned to see who'd spoken. The woman was perhaps 40, dressed in a burgundy dress that had definitely not been made on the frontier. Camille Rowan, wife of cattle baron Harrison Rowan, whose spread was the largest in 3 counties. Mara had heard about the Rowans even before arriving. Everyone had. They were the closest thing Red Creek had to aristocracy. Mrs. Rowan smiled, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "I do hope one of these gentlemen takes pity on you, dear. Though I suspect they're all calculating whether your cooking skills are worth looking at that face across the breakfast table every morning." Beside her, Harrison Rowan shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Several women in the crowd tittered. The men looked away, embarrassed on Mara's behalf, but not embarrassed enough to intervene. Mara felt heat flood her face. Not the heat of shame this time, but anger. Pure, clean anger. She opened her mouth to respond, to say something that would probably ruin whatever microscopic chances she had left, when a voice from the back of the crowd spoke. "I'll take her." Every head turned. The man pushing through the crowd was tall, not remarkably so, but he carried himself in a way that made him seem to take up more space than his actual dimensions required. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face weathered by sun and wind into something that would never be handsome but managed a certain rugged steadiness. His shirt was clean but faded, his boots dusty from riding, and his hands bore the calluses of hard work. Vance Calder. Mara recognized him from the photographs she'd studied on the train, the ones in the catalogs that matched prospective brides with men seeking wives. He'd been one of 3 men who'd written to the agency, one of 3 possibilities. She'd memorized his details. 34 years old, widower, 4 children, ranch 10 miles from Red Creek, seeking a woman to help with household duties and child rearing. His letter had been brief, almost curt. Need someone practical. Don't care about looks. Must be good with children and not afraid of work. She hadn't dared hope he'd actually follow through. His photograph showed a decent-looking man, and decent-looking men with property usually had their pick. She'd assumed he'd take one look at her and choose Sarah or Eleanor instead, but here he was, walking toward the platform with steady purpose, his gray eyes fixed on her face. Silas Mensch blinked. "Mr. Calder? You're placing a bid?" "Not a bid," Vance said flatly. "A claim. I sent payment to the agency 6 weeks ago. Miss Leland's passage was arranged based on my deposit. I'll take her home now if she's willing." Mara stared at him. She'd known abstractly that someone had paid for her train ticket, But the agency had been vague about details, and she'd half convinced herself it was some kind of general fund. The knowledge that this specific man had chosen her, sight unseen, based only on a letter, made something tight in her chest loosen slightly. "You're sure?" Silas asked, glancing between them. "I mean, the other women were already spoken for when they stepped off that stage," Vance interrupted. "Miss Leland is who I arranged to meet." He finally looked at Mara directly. "If she's agreeable to the terms we discussed in writing." It took Mara a moment to find her voice. Yes, I'm agreeable." "Then we're done here." Vance stepped up to the platform, not onto it, but close enough to offer his hand. Mara took it, his palm warm and calloused against hers, and let him help her down. Her legs felt strange, as if the solid ground beneath her boots wasn't quite solid anymore. The crowd had gone silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different, speculative, surprised. Mrs. Rowan's expression had shifted from smug superiority to something harder to read, annoyance perhaps, that her entertainment had been cut short. "Well," Silas said, recovering his composure, "congratulations to you both. I'll need you to sign some papers, Mr. Calder, and tomorrow," Vance said curtly. "It's a 2-hour ride to the ranch, and I want to get back before dark. We'll handle the paperwork next time I'm in town." He didn't wait for a response. With his hand still loosely holding Mara's elbow, not possessively, but steadying the way you might guide someone through a crowd, he began walking toward a wagon hitched at the edge of the square. Mara matched his pace, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Behind them, the crowd's murmur swelled into full conversation, speculation and gossip already beginning to spin the story of what they'd just witnessed. "Let them talk," Vance said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "They'll talk anyway." The wagon was practical rather than pretty. A working vehicle with worn benches and hay scattered in the bed. A sturdy brown horse stood in the traces, flicking flies away with its tail. Vance helped Mara up to the bench, then circled around to climb up beside her. He didn't speak as he released the brake and clicked to the horse. The wagon lurched forward, wheels creaking, and Red Creek began to recede behind them. Mara sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, trying to process what had just happened. One moment she'd been standing on that platform, convinced her life was about to take another turn toward disaster, and the next she was sitting beside a man she'd never met, heading toward a home she'd never seen, to care for children she'd never spoken to. The rational part of her brain whispered that this was insane, that she was getting into a wagon with a stranger and riding off into empty country where no one would hear her scream, that she knew nothing about Vance Calder except what he'd written in a few brief letters, and men lied in letters all the time. But the rest of her, the larger, more desperate part, whispered that insanity was relative, that staying in Red Creek with 17 cents and no prospects was arguably more insane than taking a chance on a man who'd looked past her worn dress and weathered face and said, "I'll take her." They rode in silence for perhaps 20 minutes, the town falling away until there was nothing but rolling grassland and distant mountains. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the landscape in shades of amber and gold. Finally, Vance spoke. "The children are expecting you." Mara turned to look at him. His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. "I wrote them about you," he continued. "Told them a woman was coming to help around the house. They're—" He paused, searching for words. "They're good kids, but they've been through a lot. Lost their mother 2 years back. Been managing without much female guidance since." "I'll do my best," Mara said quietly. "That's all I ask?" Vance glanced at her briefly, then back at the road. "I won't pretend this is a love match, Miss Leland. You need a home. I need help. That's the arrangement. But I keep my word, and I expect you to keep yours. I'll provide food, shelter, and protection. You'll handle the house, the cooking, and help with the children. We'll give each other respect and space. Fair?" "Fair," Mara agreed, though something in his words stung in a way she couldn't quite name. Of course this wasn't a love match. She'd known that. She hadn't come west dreaming of romance. She'd come west because the alternative was starving in Philadelphia or ending up back in Jasper Crane's clutches, and neither of those options was bearable. "The children," Vance continued, his voice softening slightly. "Thomas is 12. Responsible, takes things too serious. Grace is 9, quiet, likes to read.
Daniel is 6, all energy, into everything. And Ruby just turned 4. She doesn't remember her mother much anymore, and that... He trailed off. That must be hard, Mara said gently. Vance's jaw tightened. Life's hard. We manage. They fell back into silence. Mara watched the landscape roll past, trying to imagine what lay ahead. 4 children. 4 young people who'd already lost one mother, now being presented with a replacement they hadn't chosen. The thought made her stomach twist with anxiety. The wagon crested a rise and Vance pointed ahead. There. Mara looked where he indicated and saw a cluster of buildings in the valley below. A main house, a barn, several outbuildings, all arranged around a dusty yard. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and wispy in the evening air. It looked tired, she thought, like everything was functioning but nothing was thriving. As they descended toward the property, Mara could see details emerging. The fence posts needed mending. Weeds had overtaken what might once have been a vegetable garden. The barn door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. These weren't signs of laziness. She could see evidence of hard work everywhere, from the neatly stacked firewood to the repaired roof on the chicken coop, but rather signs of one person trying to do the work of 2, maybe 3. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house. Before Vance could set the brake, the front door burst open and children spilled out onto the porch. Mara's first impression was of eyes. 4 sets of them, ranging from curious to suspicious to cautiously hopeful, all fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to squirm. Thomas stood at the back, tall for 12, with his father's dark hair and a serious expression that made him look older than his years. Grace hovered beside him, a slip of a girl with braids coming loose from their ribbons. Daniel bounced on his toes at the front of the group, unable to stand still. And Ruby clutched a rag doll to her chest and peered at Mara from behind her older sister. "Children," Vance said as he climbed down from the wagon. "This is Miss Leland. She'll be staying with us." "Are you going to be our new Ma?" Daniel asked immediately, his voice high and clear. "Daniel," Thomas hissed. "Don't—" "It's all right," Mara said quickly, climbing down from the wagon with less grace than she would have liked. Her legs had stiffened during the ride, and she nearly stumbled before catching herself. "I'm here to help your father and take care of the house. We'll see about the rest." Grace studied her with solemn eyes. "Can you cook?" "Yes," Mara said. "I can cook." "Better than Pa?" Daniel pressed. Despite everything, the exhaustion, the anxiety, the strangeness of her situation, Mara felt a smile tug at her lips. "I don't know how your Pa cooks, so I can't say for certain, but I promise I'll do my best to make good meals." Vance had retrieved her satchel from the wagon and now stood holding it awkwardly, as if unsure what to do next. "Thomas, show Miss Leland to the spare room. Grace, help her get settled. Daniel, tend to the horse. Ruby?" He looked down at his youngest daughter, who was still staring at Mara with wide eyes. "Stay out of trouble." The children scattered to their assigned tasks. Thomas beckoned for Mara to follow him, his movements stiff with discomfort. She picked up her satchel from where Vance had set it down and followed the boy into the house. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight outside. Mara's eyes adjusted slowly, revealing a main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, currently cold and dark. A wooden table with mismatched chairs stood near the center. Shelves lined the walls, holding dishes, pots, and various supplies in haphazard organization. It was clean, or at least cleaner than she'd expected, but there was a heaviness to the space, as if the walls themselves remembered better days and mourned their passing. Thomas led her down a short hallway and stopped at a door. "This was Ma's sewing room," he said quietly. "Pa moved a bed in here for you." "Thank you," Mara said. The boy hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. "You won't stay," he said flatly. It wasn't a question. "The last woman Pa hired to help left after 3 weeks. Said it was too hard, too isolated. You'll leave too." Mara looked at him, really looked at him, at the defensive set of his shoulders, the pain hidden behind practical words, the desperate hope he was trying so hard to suppress. "I don't quit," she said simply. "That's what I told your father, and it's true. I've had jobs that would break most people, and I survived them. This, she gestured vaguely at the house around them. This is hard. I can see that. But hard isn't the same as impossible. And I've got nowhere else to go, which means I've got every reason to stay. Thomas's expression flickered, skepticism warring with the faint possibility of belief. Then he opened the door and stepped back. Supper's in an hour. Pa usually makes stew. The room was small, barely large enough for the narrow bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a small trunk at the foot of the bed. But it had a window that looked out toward the mountains, and the bed had clean sheets, and after months of sleeping in boarding house rooms that smelled of other people's despair, it seemed like luxury. Mara set her satchel on the bed and sat beside it, her hands trembling now that she was alone. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. She'd gotten off that platform, gotten into the wagon, and now she was here, in a strange house with strange people, about to begin a strange life. A knock on the doorframe made her look up. Grace stood there, still clutching her braids. "Do you need anything?" the girl asked. "Water to wash? There's a basin in the kitchen." "That would be lovely, thank you." Grace nodded and disappeared. Mara stood and began unpacking her meager belongings. 2 changes of clothes, a hairbrush, a small Bible that had been her mother's, a packet of letters from the agency, and at the very bottom, wrapped carefully in cloth, a small silver locket. She didn't open the locket. She never opened it anymore. But she couldn't bring herself to throw it away either, even though keeping it meant carrying a piece of a past she wanted to forget. Grace returned with a chipped basin full of water and a clean towel. "Supper will be ready soon," she said, then paused. "Miss Leland? What should we call you?" Mara considered this. "Mara is fine. Just Mara. Not Ma." Grace's voice was small, uncertain. "Not yet," Mara said gently. "Let's start with Mara and see where we go from there." The girl nodded and slipped away. Mara washed her face and hands, changed into her other dress, barely better than the one she'd traveled in, and redid her hair. Her reflection in the cracked mirror showed a woman who looked exactly as tired as she felt. The words from the auction echoed in her mind. "Not much to look at. Should have stayed in Philadelphia." She squared her shoulders. Let them think what they wanted. She was here now and she'd meant what she told Thomas. She didn't quit. The smell of cooking meat drew her back to the main room. Vance stood at the stove, stirring a large pot while Ruby sat at the table, swinging her legs and talking to her rag doll. Daniel was setting out bowls, mismatched like the chairs, and Thomas was slicing bread. Vance glanced up as Mara entered. "You didn't have to come help tonight. You've had a long day." "So have you," Mara said. "And I'm here to work." She moved to the stove, gently took the spoon from his hand, and began stirring the stew herself. After a moment of surprise, Vance stepped back and let her. The stew was simple: venison, potatoes, onions, carrots. Not bad, but it could use more seasoning. Mara spotted a small collection of herbs hanging near the window and added a pinch of dried thyme. The children watched her with varying degrees of curiosity. They ate at the table, Vance at one end, Thomas at the other. The younger children ranged between them. Mara sat beside Grace, aware of every eye on her as she took her first bite. "It's good," Daniel announced after tasting his portion. "Better than Pa's." "Daniel," Vance said warningly. "But it is," the boy protested. "Your father's stew was fine," Mara said quickly. "I just added a little herb, that's all." Ruby, who had been quiet throughout the meal, suddenly spoke up. "Are you going to sleep here forever?" The table went silent. Thomas glared at his little sister. Grace stared at her bowl. Daniel looked between the adults with wide eyes. Vance opened his mouth, but Mara spoke first. "I'm going to sleep here for as long as your father and I both agree I should. Does that seem fair?" Ruby considered this gravely. "What if you don't like us?" "What if you don't like me?" Mara countered gently. "Then you'll leave." Ruby's voice was matter-of-fact, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her spoon. Mara set down her own spoon and looked around the table, meeting each child's eyes in turn. "I can't promise that everything will be perfect. I can't promise I'll never make mistakes or that you'll always like everything I do. But I can promise that I'm not looking for reasons to leave. I'm looking for reasons to stay.
And from what I've seen so far, there are at least 4 good reasons sitting at this table. Thomas's expression remained skeptical, but something in his posture relaxed slightly. Grace offered a tiny smile. Daniel grinned outright. And Ruby studied Mara for a long moment, then went back to her stew, apparently satisfied. After supper, Vance announced it was bedtime for the younger children. Daniel protested, but was overruled. Ruby climbed down from her chair, and, to Mara's surprise, walked over and stood in front of her. "Will you tuck me in?" the little girl asked. Mara glanced at Vance, who looked equally surprised, but nodded. "If you'd like me to." She followed Ruby down the hall to a small room the little girl shared with Grace. The beds were neatly made, though the room had the cluttered feeling of a space without enough adult supervision. Clothes draped over a chair, books stacked haphazardly, a collection of small stones and leaves arranged on the windowsill. Ruby climbed into her bed, still clutching her rag doll. Mara pulled the blanket up to the girl's chin. "Comfortable?" "Mama used to sing," Ruby said quietly. "Pa can't remember the words." Mara's throat tightened. "I don't know what songs your mama sang, but I could hum something, if you'd like." Ruby nodded. So Mara hummed, an old lullaby her own mother had sung years ago in a different life. Ruby's eyes drooped, and within minutes she was asleep, her breathing soft and even. When Mara returned to the main room, she found Vance washing dishes while Thomas dried them. Grace sat by the fireplace with a book. The scene was so domestic, so normal, that for a moment Mara felt like an intruder. "She asleep?" Vance asked without turning around. "Yes." "She doesn't usually take to people that fast." He handed a plate to Thomas. "Must have good instincts." Mara wasn't sure if that was a compliment or just an observation, so she said nothing. Instead, she picked up a dishcloth and began helping with the cleanup. They worked in silence, establishing a rhythm. Outside, full darkness had fallen, and through the windows Mara could see more stars than she'd ever seen in Philadelphia. The vastness of the sky here was almost frightening, so much space, so much emptiness, so much possibility for things to go wrong. But there was also possibility for things to go right. When the last dish was dried and put away, Vance sent Thomas and Grace to bed. Then he stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, clearly unused to having another adult present at this hour. "You should get some rest," he said finally. "Tomorrow will be busy. Laundry needs doing, and the garden needs tending, and Ruby will want attention." "Mr. Calder," Mara interrupted gently. "I know what needs doing. That's why I'm here." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time since he'd claimed her at the auction, she saw something beyond practicality in his eyes. Gratitude, perhaps, or relief, or maybe just exhaustion so deep it had worn grooves into his soul. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for coming, for staying, for—" He gestured vaguely at the space around them. "For this." "Thank you for choosing me," Mara replied, "when no one else would." Something passed between them in that moment. Not affection, not yet, but understanding. They were both desperate people who'd made a practical arrangement, but desperation didn't preclude dignity, and practicality didn't preclude kindness. "Good night, Miss Leland," Vance said. "Good night, Mr. Calder." Mara retreated to her small room and closed the door. She changed into her nightgown, washed her face again in the now cold water, and climbed into bed. The mattress was thin but adequate, the pillow lumpy but clean. Through the walls she could hear the house settling around her, floorboards creaking, wind whistling past the windows, the distant sound of an owl calling. Beyond that, silence, the vast empty silence of the frontier night. She thought about the platform, about standing there while people laughed, about Mrs. Rowan's cruel smile, about Vance's steady voice cutting through the noise. "I'll take her." She thought about Ruby's question. "Will you tuck me in?" She thought about tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that, stretching ahead into unknown territory. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Mara Leland felt something that might, if she were very careful and very lucky, eventually grow into hope. Outside her window, the stars wheeled slowly across the infinite Wyoming sky, bearing witness to one woman's decision to stop running and start building. One meal, one tucked-in child, one washed dish at a time. The auction was over. The real work was just beginning.
Dawn arrived too early, slicing through the thin curtains of Mara's room with insistent light. She woke to the sound of a rooster crowing, and more distantly, the clatter of someone moving around in the kitchen. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then memory returned in a rush. The auction, the wagon ride, 4 pairs of watchful eyes. She dressed quickly in the dimness, braiding her hair with practiced efficiency. When she emerged from her room, she found Vance already at the stove, coaxing life into the fire, while Ruby sat at the table rubbing sleep from her eyes. "You're up early," Vance said without turning around. "So are you," Mara replied, moving to take over at the stove. "Let me." He hesitated, then stepped aside. "Coffee's in the tin, eggs in the basket by the door. Usually just scramble them." Mara surveyed the kitchen with a more critical eye than she'd managed the night before. The space was functional but joyless, everything arranged for efficiency rather than comfort. Dish towels hung crooked on their hooks. The spice collection was sparse and disorganized. A film of dust coated the tops of the higher shelves where a busy man's reach didn't extend often enough. She found the coffee, started it brewing, then located the eggs. There were only 6, not enough for 5 people if everyone got a decent portion. She'd need to check the henhouse later, see what production looked like. While the eggs cooked, she sliced yesterday's leftover bread and set the table. Grace appeared, followed by Daniel, both moving with the sluggish uncertainty of children who hadn't slept quite enough. Thomas was last, already dressed in work clothes, his expression set in that serious mask that seemed to be his default. They ate quickly, efficiently. Vance outlined the day's work between bites: fence repairs in the north pasture, checking the irrigation channels, mucking out the barn. Thomas would help him. The other children had their own chores. Mara was to familiarize herself with the house and property, see what needed doing most urgently. "There's a root cellar around back," Vance said. "Supplies are running low. We'll need to go to town for provisions next week." He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. "You'll probably want fabric for dresses. The general store can put it on my account." Mara kept her voice neutral. "That's generous, but I can manage with what I have." "You can't manage with 2 dresses for long out here. The work's too hard." He stood, carried his plate to the basin. "Get what you need. It's practical, not charity." Before she could respond, he was out the door, Thomas trailing behind him. The other children scattered to their assigned tasks: Grace to make the beds, Daniel to collect eggs, Ruby to stay out of everyone's way, though no one said it quite that bluntly. Mara stood in the sudden quiet of the kitchen, surrounded by dirty dishes and the fading warmth of the fire. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The next week unfolded in a rhythm of discovery and adjustment. Mara learned the geography of the ranch, where the well water ran coldest, which hens were broody and which were reliable layers, how the afternoon wind always came from the west and brought dust with it. She learned the children's patterns too. Grace hid when she was sad, taking her books to a small clearing behind the barn where an old log made a decent seat. Daniel's endless energy masked a desperate need for approval. He'd try anything if you told him it would make his father proud. Ruby attached herself to Mara's skirts and followed her everywhere, chattering about her ragdoll's adventures with the unself-conscious creativity of a 4-year-old. And Thomas watched everything. He was always nearby when Mara attempted something new, ready to criticize or correct, testing her competence and her staying power with equal measure. "That's not how Ma folded the linens," he said on the 3rd day, appearing in the doorway while Mara worked. She didn't look up from her task. "How did she fold them?" He showed her a different technique, corners tucked more precisely. Mara tried it his way. It worked better. "Thank you," she said simply. He blinked, surprised by her lack of defensiveness. "You're welcome." Small victories, Mara told herself. Small victories accumulated. Vance remained distant but not unkind. He spoke in practical statements rather than conversation. "The fence is mended. Thomas did good work today. Storm coming tomorrow probably." He rose before dawn and worked until darkness forced him inside. At meals, he ate whatever Mara prepared with minimal comment, though she noticed he always finished his plate, even on days when she experimented with new recipes that didn't quite succeed. On the 8th day, Mara woke to find the kitchen already occupied. Not by Vance this time, but by Grace, who stood at the counter staring at a bowl of apples with an expression of deep concentration. "Couldn't sleep?"
Mara asked gently. Grace jumped. I wanted to make something for Pa. He likes apple pie, but I don't know how, and Ma's recipe book is... She gestured vaguely toward a shelf where a leather-bound journal sat gathering dust. May I look? Grace nodded, relief flooding her features. The recipe book was a treasure, pages filled with a woman's careful handwriting, notes in the margins about adjustments and preferences. Emma's apple pie, read one heading with a note below. Vance's favorite, extra cinnamon.
Mara felt like an intruder reading these intimate domestic records, but Grace was watching her hopefully, so she pushed the discomfort aside. Let's make it together. You can help measure. They worked in the pre-dawn darkness, lighting a single lamp to see by. Grace proved a capable assistant, her small hands deft with the measuring cups. As they rolled out the dough, the girl spoke quietly. Ma used to let me help sometimes. Thomas says I shouldn't try to copy her, that it's not the same, but I don't want Pa to forget what her pies tasted like. Mara's hand stilled on the rolling pin. Your Pa won't forget. Memory doesn't work that way. But Grace... She waited until the girl looked at her. Making something with love isn't copying, it's honoring. Your Ma would be glad you remember her recipes. She'd be glad you want to make your Pa happy. Do you think so? I know so. The pie went into the oven just as the rest of the house began stirring. By the time Vance and Thomas came in from the early barn chores, the kitchen smelled of cinnamon and butter and caramelized apples. Vance stopped in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Grace made it, Mara said quickly. I just supervised. Grace ducked her head, suddenly shy. It's Ma's recipe, your favorite. Something shifted in Vance's face, a crack in that careful control he maintained. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and pulled Grace into a hug that lifted her off her feet. Thank you, sweetheart. Thank you. Over Grace's head, his eyes met Mara's. She saw gratitude there, and something else. A recognition that she was doing more than cooking and cleaning. She was helping these children remember how to reach for their father and helping him remember how to let them. The moment passed. Vance set Grace down, ruffled her hair, and moved to the stove for coffee. But the atmosphere in the kitchen had shifted somehow, warmth creeping into spaces that had been cold. That afternoon, while Vance and Thomas were occupied in the far pasture and the younger children played in the yard, Mara finally ventured into the abandoned vegetable garden. It had once been substantial. She could see the bones of it beneath the weeds. Neat rows marked out. Wooden stakes still standing, though the plants they'd once supported were long dead. A small scarecrow tilted drunkenly in the center, its burlap face weathered to featurelessness. Mara knelt in the dirt and began pulling weeds. The work was meditative, requiring just enough attention to occupy her hands while leaving her mind free to wander. She thought about Philadelphia, about the factory where she'd worked 16-hour days for pennies, about the boarding house where she'd lived, sharing a room with 3 other women, all of them too tired to talk much, about Jasper Crane. No, she wouldn't think about him. That was over. That was behind her. What are you doing? She looked up to find Thomas standing at the garden's edge, his arms crossed in that defensive posture he favored. Clearing the garden? Thought I might plant some vegetables if there's time before the frost comes. Ma's garden. It wasn't a question, and his tone carried warning. Mara sat back on her heels. Yes, your Ma's garden. But gardens are for growing things, Thomas, not for letting die because someone who loved them isn't here anymore. I think... She chose her words carefully. I think your Ma would rather see food growing here than weeds. You didn't know her. You don't know what she'd want. You're right. I didn't know her, but I know gardens and I know waste, and I know that the best way to honor someone who built something good is to keep it alive. She pulled another weed, her voice gentling. If you think this is wrong, I'll stop. But if you think your Ma would want her children fed from the work of her hands, even now, then help me clear it. Thomas stood there for a long moment, his jaw working. Then, without a word, he knelt beside her and began pulling weeds, too. They worked in silence until Grace found them and joined in. Then Daniel, who made a game of seeing who could pull the biggest weed. Even Ruby contributed, collecting the pulled vegetation in a pile she insisted was a castle for beetles. Vance found them there as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. He stood watching, 4 children and 1 woman, all dirt-stained and sweating, working together in the skeleton of his late wife's garden. Mara looked up and met his eyes, uncertain of his reaction. "Supper might be late," she said. "We got distracted." "We're fixing Ma's garden," Ruby announced proudly. "Mara says we can grow food." Vance's expression remained unreadable for a moment longer. Then he stepped into the garden, knelt beside Daniel, and started pulling weeds. "Then we'd better get it finished before dark." 2 weeks after Mara's arrival came the Autumn Harvest Festival, Red Creek's annual celebration marking the end of growing season. Vance announced they'd be attending, his tone making it clear this wasn't optional. "The children need to see other people," he said over breakfast, "and I need to settle accounts with some of the other ranchers." Mara's stomach knotted with anxiety. She'd successfully avoided town since the auction, but she'd known this reprieve couldn't last forever. "Of course. What should I prepare?" "It's a potluck. Folks bring dishes to share." Vance paused. "Emma used to make a vinegar coleslaw. People expected it." The expectation hung in the air. Grace looked between them, worry creasing her young face. "I can try the coleslaw," Mara said carefully. "Or I could make something else. Something that's mine instead of trying to copy what your wife made." Vance considered this. "Make what you're good at." So Mara made bread. 3 loaves of herb-studded bread that made the house smell like a bakery. It was what she knew, what she could do well without reference books or inherited recipes. When they loaded into the wagon on festival morning, the bread sat wrapped in clean cloths, warm and fragrant. The festival was held in a large meadow just outside town. By the time they arrived, dozens of families had already gathered. Long tables groaned under the weight of contributed food. Children ran shrieking between adults. Men clustered in groups discussing weather and livestock prices. Women supervised the food and gossiped with the practiced efficiency of long association. Mara climbed down from the wagon, her hands smoothing nervously over her dress. The same faded blue she'd worn to the auction, now cleaned and mended as best she could manage. She was conscious of eyes turning toward them, conversations pausing mid-sentence. "Stay close," Vance said quietly, and she realized with a start that he meant it as protection, not instruction. They approached the food tables. Mara set her bread down among the other offerings, trying not to notice how her simple loaves looked beside elaborate cakes and beautifully presented salads. A woman standing nearby, older, with kind eyes and work-worn hands, smiled at her. "You're the new Mrs. Calder, aren't you? I'm Martha Hendricks. My husband owns the spread east of yours." "I'm not." Mara started to correct the title, then stopped. What was she exactly? Not a wife, not officially, not a housekeeper, not really. Something in between that had no good name. "It's nice to meet you." "Your bread smells wonderful. Used to bake for a living?" "I worked in a bakery for a while, in Philadelphia." "Big city girl, then. Must be quite an adjustment out here." There was no judgment in Martha's tone, just curiosity. Mara found herself relaxing slightly. "Different, yes, but not bad different." They talked for a few more minutes, easy conversation about weather and recipes and the peculiarities of frontier life. Mara felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Maybe this wouldn't be so terrible after all. Then a voice cut across the pleasant chatter like a knife through silk. "Well, well, if it isn't the auction bride. Tell me, dear, how does it feel to be chosen last?" Mara turned to find Camille Rowan bearing down on her, resplendent in a dress that probably cost more than Vance earned in 6 months. Several other well-dressed women flanked her like attendants surrounding a queen. Martha Hendricks' expression hardened. "Camille?" "I'm just making conversation, Martha. Surely our new neighbor doesn't mind a friendly question." Mrs. Rowan's smile was poison wrapped in politeness. After all, it must have been quite the experience, standing up there while the entire town decided you weren't worth bidding on. How humiliating. Though I suppose Vance Calder took pity on you, he always did have a soft heart for strays. Heat flooded Mara's face. Around them, conversations had stopped. People were watching now, waiting to see how she'd respond. The old instinct rose up, to apologize, to make herself smaller, to accept whatever cruelty was being offered because resistance only made things worse. But then she heard Ruby's voice somewhere behind her, calling for Mara. And she thought about Grace making pie in the pre-dawn darkness, and Thomas grudgingly helping in the garden, and Vance's quiet "thank you" in the kitchen that first night. She squared her shoulders and looked Camille Rowan directly in the eyes. "You're right. It was humiliating, standing there while people I'd never met decided I wasn't worth their time. But then Mr. Calder stepped forward, and I learned something important, that one person's opinion matters more than a crowd's mockery, especially when that one person sees value where others see none." Mrs. Rowan's smile faltered slightly. Mara continued, her voice steady. "I'm sure someone of your refinement can't possibly understand what it means to need something as simple as a chance, but I'm grateful for mine. And I'm trying every day to prove Mr. Calder's faith in me wasn't misplaced." "Faith?" Mrs. Rowan laughed, but it sounded forced now. "My dear girl, he needed a servant. Don't mistake necessity for faith." "Camille, that's enough." Mara hadn't heard Vance approach, but suddenly he was there, standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His hand came to rest lightly at the small of her back, a gesture that could have been casual but felt intensely protective. "Vance," Mrs. Rowan purred, her tone shifting instantly to something flirtatious. "I was just getting to know your new employee." "She's not my employee," Vance said flatly. The crowd had grown now, people openly watching. "Miss Leland came to help with my household and my children. She's doing excellent work at both. If you have concerns about my domestic arrangements, you're welcome to voice them to me privately. Otherwise, I'd appreciate you leaving her alone." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Mrs. Rowan's face had gone red, though whether from embarrassment or anger Mara couldn't tell. "Well," Mrs. Rowan said finally, her voice tight. "How gallant of you, defending the help." "She's not the help," Vance repeated, and his hand pressed more firmly against Mara's back. "She's—" He paused, seeming to search for the right word. "She's part of my household, under my protection, and if you insult her again, you insult me, Mrs. Rowan stared at him for a moment longer, then turned on her heel and stalked away, her attendant scurrying after her. The crowd began to disperse, conversations resuming with the electric quality of people who'd just witnessed unexpected drama. Vance's hand dropped from Mara's back. "You all right?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good. Come on. Thomas wants to enter the shooting competition, and I should supervise before he hurts himself trying to impress the Miller girl." He walked away, leaving Mara standing by the food table with Martha Hendricks, who was smiling broadly. "That," Martha said with satisfaction, "was the most excitement we've had at one of these festivals in years. Camille's been the unquestioned queen bee around here for too long. Good to see her taken down a peg." "I didn't mean to cause trouble," Mara said weakly. "Trouble? Honey, you stood up for yourself with dignity. That's not causing trouble. That's refusing to accept it." Martha patted her arm. "Come on, let me introduce you to some people who'll actually be glad to meet you." The rest of the festival passed in a blur. Mara met what felt like dozens of people, some friendly, some neutral, a few who looked at her with the same dismissive assessment as Mrs. Rowan, but had the grace not to voice it. She watched Thomas win third place in the shooting competition and swell with pride. She helped Grace pick wildflowers from the meadow edge. She carried Ruby on her hip when the little girl grew tired, the child's head heavy on her shoulder. And she caught Vance watching her, not constantly, but occasionally, his expression thoughtful in a way she couldn't quite interpret. As the sun began setting and families started packing up to leave, Mara found herself back at the food tables, helping collect dishes. Her bread was gone, she noticed. Every slice. It felt like a tiny victory. "Mara!" She turned to find Daniel running toward her, his face split with a grin. "Pa says we can stay for the music. They're going to have dancing." "That's nice, sweetheart. Will you dance with me? Pa never dances anymore, and Thomas says he's too old for it, but I want to dance." Before she could answer, the first notes of a fiddle cut through the evening air. Someone else joined in with a guitar. The music was simple, cheerful, the kind of folk tunes that made feet tap whether you wanted them to or not. Daniel grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the clearing that had been designated as a dance floor. Mara let herself be led, laughing at his enthusiasm.
They weren't really dancing so much as spinning in circles while Daniel jumped around with more energy than rhythm, but his joy was infectious. When that song ended and another began, Grace appeared. My turn? Mara danced with Grace, then with Ruby, whom she lifted and spun until the child shrieked with delight. Other children joined in, forming a loose circle of dancing, laughing young people. Mara found herself genuinely smiling, the tension of earlier melting away in the music and movement. Then the tempo changed. The fiddle player called out, "Partner dance!" and the children scattered, giggling, leaving Mara standing alone in the clearing. She started to retreat to the sidelines when a hand touched her elbow. "May I?" She turned to find Vance standing there, his expression uncertain in a way she'd never seen it. Around them, other couples were pairing up, husbands and wives, sweethearts, even friends who just wanted to dance. "You don't have to," Mara said quickly. "I know you said you don't dance anymore." "Daniel's been after me to try for months. Seems like a good night for it." He offered his hand. "If you're willing." She placed her hand in his, and he led her into a simple waltz position, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers, proper distance maintained between them. They began to move, awkward at first as they found the rhythm, then smoother as the music carried them. Vance was a decent dancer, she discovered. Not fancy, but solid, confident in his movements. He led well, giving her time to follow. "Thank you," she said quietly as they turned, "for what you said earlier, to Mrs. Rowan." "I meant it. You didn't deserve that treatment. A lot of people think I do. The leftover bride." She tried to keep her tone light, but bitterness crept in anyway. Vance's hand tightened at her waist. "A lot of people are fools. Their opinion doesn't change the facts." "What facts?" "That you've worked harder in 2 weeks than most people work in 2 months. That my children are happier than they've been in 2 years. That my house feels like a home again instead of just a place we sleep." He met her eyes directly. "That I chose you not because no one else was left, but because your letter was honest and I needed honesty more than I needed beauty or refinement." Mara's throat tightened. "I'm not sure I believe that." "Then watch," Vance said simply. "Watch how things unfold, and maybe you'll start to believe it." The song ended. They separated, that proper distance reasserting itself. But something had shifted. Some invisible boundary had been crossed, or at least approached close enough to see what lay on the other side. The ride home was quiet, the children dozing in the wagon bed while Mara and Vance sat on the bench. The stars were brilliant overhead, unfamiliar constellations wheeling through the immense dark sky. "They talked about you," Vance said abruptly. "After Emma died. Said I should remarry quickly, get someone to take care of the children. Like it was that simple. Like any woman would do as long as she could cook and clean." Mara waited, sensing he needed to finish this thought. "I tried hiring help instead. 3 different women over the course of a year. They all left. Too hard, they said, too isolated, too much work." He paused. "So I wrote to the agency, listed what I needed, got 3 responses. Yours was the shortest. Just facts. No promises of devotion or pretty words, just..." He seemed to be searching for the right phrase. "Just enough honesty to make me believe you'd stay." "I will stay," Mara said softly. "As long as you'll have me." "Good." They didn't speak again until the ranch came into view, dark except for the lamp they'd left burning in the window. As Vance pulled the wagon to a stop, Ruby stirred in the back. "Are we home?" she asked sleepily. "Yes, sweetheart," Vance replied. "We're home." Mara helped carry the drowsy children inside, tucking them into their beds with the practiced efficiency she'd developed over the past weeks. When she returned to the kitchen, Vance was banking the fire for the night. "That was a good day," he said without turning around. "Thank you for being part of it." "Thank you for defending me." He did look at her then, his expression serious in the firelight. "You don't need to keep thanking me for basic decency, Miss Leland. It's what you're owed." "Then the same goes for you, Mr. Calder." They stood there in the dimness, the fire crackling softly, neither quite willing to retreat to their separate rooms. Finally, Vance cleared his throat. "Good night, Miss Leland." "Good night, Mr. Calder." Mara lay in bed that night, replaying the day. The confrontation, the dancing, Vance's unexpected defense. Most of all, she replayed his words. I chose you not because no one else was left, but because your letter was honest. For the first time since stepping onto that auction platform, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't just someone's last resort. Maybe she was someone's actual choice. Outside her window, Wyoming stretched vast and dark beneath its canopy of stars. And inside this small room, in this strange house, Mara Leland finally allowed hope to take root and begin, slowly, tentatively, to grow. The morning after the festival dawned cold and clear, the first real hint that autumn was sliding toward winter. Mara woke to frost patterns on her window and the sound of Vance already moving around in the kitchen. She dressed quickly, her breath visible in the chilled air of her small room, and emerged to find him wrestling with the cantankerous stove. Damn things being temperamental, he muttered, then caught himself. Pardon the language. I've heard worse. Mara moved to help, adjusting the flue in a way that made the fire catch properly. There. Should burn better now. They worked together preparing breakfast, a routine that had become comfortable over the past weeks. Vance sliced bacon while Mara mixed batter for pancakes. The children filtered in one by one, Ruby still half asleep and clutching her rag doll, Daniel bouncing with his usual morning energy despite the late night. Can we go back to the festival today? Daniel asked around a mouthful of pancake. It's over, son, Vance said. Back to regular work. The boy's face fell, but he didn't argue. Thomas ate in silence, already mentally preparing for whatever tasks his father had planned. Grace kept glancing at Mara with a small smile, as if they shared some secret understanding after the previous day's events. The week that followed settled into a deeper rhythm than before. Mara found herself anticipating the household's needs before they arose, knowing that Thomas preferred his coffee black, while Vance took his with a little sugar, that Ruby needed extra time in the mornings to fully wake up, that Grace would retreat to her clearing when the weight of missing her mother grew too heavy. She also noticed things changing in how the children approached her. Daniel started bringing her small treasures, interesting rocks, a bird's feather, a piece of colored glass he'd found near the creek. Grace asked her opinion on which dress to wear, which book to read next. Even Thomas, still guarded, began seeking her out when he encountered household problems he couldn't solve alone. The lamp in Pa's room is smoking, he said one afternoon, appearing in the kitchen where Mara was kneading bread dough. I cleaned the chimney, but it's still doing it. Could be the wick needs trimming. Want me to show you how? They worked together on the lamp, Mara explaining the mechanics while Thomas listened with intense focus. When the lamp burned clean again, he nodded with satisfaction. Ma used to do this, he said quietly. I never paid attention to how. You're paying attention now. That's what matters. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and some of the guardedness in his expression eased. You're not trying to replace her. It wasn't a question, but Mara answered anyway. No, I couldn't even if I wanted to. Your mother built something here that was hers, her garden, her recipes, her way of loving all of you. I'm just trying to build something of my own alongside it. Thomas nodded slowly. That's good. He hesitated, then added, You're doing okay. At the building thing. Coming from Thomas, it was high praise. Mara felt warmth bloom in her chest, but contentment, she was learning, was a fragile thing on the frontier. It was late afternoon 2 days later when Mara walked into town for supplies. Vance had offered to accompany her, but she'd insisted she could manage. The list was short, the weather was good, and she wanted to prove she could handle simple tasks independently. He'd relented after making her promise to be back before dark. The walk was pleasant, the autumn air crisp and clean. Red Creek bustled with its usual activity, wagons rolling through, men loading supplies, women going about their errands. Mara headed straight for the general store, hoping to avoid unnecessary interaction. She was examining a bolt of fabric. Vance had been right about needing another dress, when a hand closed around her upper arm. Hello, Mara. The voice turned her blood to ice. She spun around and found herself face to face with Jasper Crane. He looked exactly as she remembered, tall, well-dressed, with handsome features that disguised something rotten beneath. His grip on her arm was firm but not yet painful, the kind of hold that could tighten in an instant. Let go of me, Mara said, her voice low and steady despite the panic clawing up her throat.
Now, is that any way to greet an old friend? Jasper's smile was pleasant, his tone conversational. To anyone watching, they might have been acquaintances having a casual reunion. I've been looking for you for months. Imagine my surprise when I heard about a mail-order bride from Philadelphia matching your description. I said let go. His fingers tightened slightly. We have matters to discuss. You left rather abruptly. I left because you wouldn't accept no for an answer. I was offering you security, a position in my household, very generous terms. Mara forced herself to meet his eyes. You were offering to make me your mistress. I declined. That should have been the end of it. You didn't have the right to decline. His voice remained pleasant, but something cold flickered in his eyes. I'd invested considerable time and resources in you, training you, providing you opportunities. You owed me. I owed you nothing. Mara tried to pull her arm free, but his grip was iron now. People were starting to notice, conversations pausing as heads turned their direction. You owe me everything, Jasper said, his smile never wavering, and I've come to collect. You're going to walk outside with me very calmly, and we're going to have a proper conversation about your return to Philadelphia. I'm not going anywhere with you. Oh, I think you are. Unless you'd like me to make a scene. Tell everyone here what you really are. A woman who accepted my patronage, lived in my house, and then fled like a thief in the night when I expected reasonable compensation for my generosity. It was the old threat, the one he'd used before. Ruin her reputation, make it impossible for her to find decent work, paint her as something she wasn't. In Philadelphia, where he had influence and connections, it had worked. She'd run rather than fight because fighting seemed impossible, but she wasn't in Philadelphia anymore. Tell them, Mara said clearly, loudly enough that the surrounding conversations died completely. Tell everyone here your version. Then I'll tell them mine, about how you hired me as a kitchen worker and decided that gave you ownership of more than my labor. About how you cornered me in hallways and made suggestions that had nothing to do with my job. About how when I tried to leave, you threatened to destroy any chance I had of finding other employment. Tell them, Mr. Crane, let's see whose story they believe. Jasper's pleasant mask cracked. You little... I believe the lady asked you to let go. Mara had never been so grateful to hear Silas Mensch's voice. The shopkeeper moved out from behind his counter, his bulk making him suddenly imposing, despite his generally jovial nature. Behind him, two other men had risen from where they'd been sitting by the stove, ranch hands Mara recognized from the festival. This is a private matter, Jasper said, but his grip on Mara's arm had loosened slightly. Don't look private to me, Silas said. Looks like a man grabbing a woman who don't want to be grabbed. We don't care for that kind of behavior around here. I'm her former employer. She has obligations. She's a resident of Red Creek now, Silas interrupted, under the protection of Vance Calder. Whatever disputes you had in Philadelphia don't carry weight here. Now let her go or we'll have a problem. For a moment, Jasper looked like he might argue further. Then he released Mara's arm with a deliberate slowness that was somehow more threatening than if he'd shoved her away. This isn't over, he said quietly, for her ears only. You belong to me, Mara. One way or another, I'll make you understand that. He turned and walked out of the store, leaving Mara standing there with her heart hammering against her ribs. Her arm ached where he'd gripped it. You all right, Miss Leland? Silas asked gently. She nodded, not trusting her voice. You know that man? Yes. From Philadelphia. He was my employer. She stopped, unsure how much to reveal. He wanted more than employee services, Silas finished grimly. Yeah, I gathered that. You're safe here, Miss Leland. Red Creek takes care of its own, but you should tell Vance about this. He'll want to know. Mara completed her shopping in a daze, her hands shaking as she counted out coins. The walk back to the ranch seemed longer than before, every shadow making her jump, every sound of hoofbeats making her heart race. Jasper's words echoed in her head. This isn't over. She'd been foolish to think she could escape him by simply running far enough. Men like Jasper Crane didn't let go of things they considered their property. Vance was in the barn when she arrived, and she seriously considered not telling him about the encounter. But secrets had a way of festering, and besides, Silas was right. Vance needed to know. She found him mending tack, his hands working with practiced efficiency. He looked up as she entered, and whatever he saw in her face made him set down his work immediately. What happened? She told him everything about Jasper's arrival in Philadelphia 2 years ago, how he'd hired her for his household staff, how his attention had gradually shifted from employer to something predatory, how he'd cornered her, made suggestions, then threats, how she'd fled to the mail-order bride agency as a last desperate escape. Vance listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. When she finished, describing the encounter in the store, his jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping. Where is he staying? His voice was dangerously quiet. I don't know. Vance, please don't. Don't what? Don't protect you from a man who thinks he owns you? He stood, his full height suddenly imposing. That's exactly what I'm going to do. Violence won't solve this. It'll only make things worse. I'm not talking about violence. I'm talking about making it clear that you're under my protection, and any man who touches you without permission will answer to me. He moved toward the barn door, but Mara stepped into his path. Please, just let it be for tonight. He's probably staying at the hotel. He'll leave town soon enough when he realizes I'm not going with him. Vance looked down at her, conflict clear in his expression. He grabbed you. In public. That's not a man who gives up easily. No, Mara admitted quietly. It's not. But I'm not the same woman I was in Philadelphia. I'm not alone anymore. That matters. Something in her words seemed to reach him. His shoulders relaxed slightly, though tension still radiated from him. If he comes near you again, I'll tell you immediately. I promise. They stood there in the barn's dimness, hay dust dancing in the shafts of late afternoon light. Finally, Vance nodded. All right, but I'm riding into town tomorrow to make some things clear, and you don't go anywhere alone until this is resolved. Understood? Understood. That night, Mara lay awake long after the house had gone silent. She kept seeing Jasper's face, hearing his voice. You belong to me. The words made her skin crawl, made her want to scrub herself clean of the memory of his hand on her arm. She must have eventually slept because she woke to Ruby's scream. Mara was out of bed and running before conscious thought caught up with her actions. The hallway was thick with smoke, acrid and choking, flames visible through the window, not the house, thank God, but the barn. The barn was on fire. She burst into Ruby and Grace's room. Both girls were awake, Ruby sobbing, Grace frozen with fear. Get your brother, Mara ordered Grace. Get Thomas and Daniel. Get them outside, away from the buildings. Go now! Grace unfroze and ran. Mara scooped up Ruby and followed, meeting Thomas in the hallway. He'd already grabbed Daniel. Where's Pa? Thomas shouted over the roar of flames. I don't know. Get your siblings out? I'll find him. She thrust Ruby at Thomas and ran for Vance's room. Empty. The front door stood open, smoke billowing in. Through it she could see Vance running toward the barn, his shirt thrown on but not buttoned. The horses, he was shouting. The horses are inside! Horror flooded through Mara. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames shooting through the roof, the sound of terrified horses screaming cutting through the night. Without the horses, the ranch couldn't function. They'd lose everything. Vance reached the barn door and pulled it open. Smoke poured out in a black cloud. He disappeared inside. No! Mara ran after him, her bare feet stumbling over rough ground. She could hear Thomas behind her, shouting for her to stop, but she didn't stop. Vance was in that inferno, and if he died trying to save the horses, she'd never forgive herself for standing by and watching. The heat hit her like a wall when she reached the barn door. Flames crawled up the walls, eating through timber that had stood for decades. The smoke was thick enough to drown in, burning her eyes and throat. She could barely see, but she could hear. Horses screaming in terror, Vance's voice shouting commands. She stumbled forward, following the sound, found him struggling with the gate to the first stall, the panicked mare inside rearing and striking at the walls. Get out! He roared when he saw her. Mara, get out! Not without you. She grabbed the halter hanging beside the stall, managed to get it over the mare's head despite the horse's thrashing. Together they got the mare moving, pushed her toward the door. The horse bolted as soon as she saw open air, racing away from the flames. There were 3 more horses. The smoke was getting thicker, the heat more intense. A beam cracked somewhere above them, sending a shower of sparks cascading down. Vance was already at the second stall, fighting with the latch that had warped in the heat. "It's stuck!" Mara grabbed a shovel leaning against the wall and used it as a lever. The latch broke. Another horse freed, sent running into the night. The third horse was already down, overcome by smoke. They got it to its feet, half carrying, half dragging it toward the door. Mara's lungs burned, each breath like inhaling fire. Black spots danced in her vision. One more horse. The gelding in the last stall was Thomas's favorite, a gentle gray named Storm. The animal was trapped behind a gate that had jammed completely, wood swollen with heat. Vance threw his weight against it, but it wouldn't budge. "Leave it!" Mara shouted. "We have to leave it!" "I can't." The anguish in Vance's voice cut through her. "Thomas loves this horse. I can't." A terrible crack sounded from above. Mara looked up and saw the main support beam splitting, flames eating through its center. It was going to fall. It was going to fall right on top of them. She acted on instinct, throwing herself at Vance, using all her weight to knock him sideways. They both went down hard as the beam crashed where Vance had been standing seconds before. The impact sent a shockwave through the building. So, more beams began to crack, the structural integrity failing. "Move!" Mara scrambled to her feet, hauling Vance up with her. The door seemed impossibly far away now, the path blocked by burning debris. Vance grabbed her hand and pulled her to the side wall where the flames hadn't reached yet. He kicked at a loose board once, twice, 3 times until it gave way, creating a gap barely wide enough to squeeze through. He shoved her through first. She tumbled out into blessedly cool air, her lungs seizing as she tried to breathe. Hands grabbed her, Thomas, pulling her away from the building. She turned back to see Vance squeezing through the gap, his shirt catching on a nail, flames reaching toward him. Then he was out, stumbling forward, and Thomas had him too, both of them dragging their father away from the barn as the roof collapsed inward with a roar like thunder. They made it perhaps 20 feet before Vance's legs gave out. He went down hard, Mara collapsing beside him. Thomas stood over them, his face streaked with tears, Daniel and Grace clinging to each other nearby, Ruby sobbing in Grace's arms. "Pa," Thomas was saying, his voice breaking. "Pa, you're okay. You're okay." But Vance wasn't responding. His eyes had rolled back, his body going limp. Mara pressed her ear to his chest and heard his heartbeat, fast but steady. He'd passed out, probably from smoke inhalation. "He needs a doctor," she said, her voice raw and rasping. "Thomas, take Daniel and ride to town. Get Dr. Morrison. Grace, bring water. Ruby, stay with me." The children scattered to their tasks. Mara knelt beside Vance, checking him for burns. His hands were blistered, his face covered in soot, but nothing seemed life-threatening. The real danger was his lungs. She tilted his head back, trying to keep his airway clear. Behind her, the barn continued to burn, collapsing in on itself in stages, each crash sending up fresh towers of sparks into the night sky. 3 horses stood in the yard, trembling but alive. Storm was gone. Grace returned with water. Mara used a torn piece of her nightgown to wet Vance's face, cleaning away some of the soot, checking his breathing. It was labored but present. "Is he going to die?" Ruby asked in a small voice. "No," Mara said firmly, with more confidence than she felt. "He's going to be fine." She looked at the burning barn, at Vance unconscious on the ground, at 4 frightened children depending on her to know what to do. This was disaster. This was everything falling apart. But she was still here, still breathing, still able to act. "Grace, get blankets. Your father will need them when he wakes. Ruby, stay close to your sister. Daniel went with Thomas, so it's just us for now. We're going to take care of your pa, and we're going to be okay." Grace ran for the house. Ruby stayed pressed against Mara's side. They waited there in the flickering light of the burning barn, watching over Vance as his breathing slowly steadied and deepened. It wasn't until later, much later, after Dr. Morrison had arrived and declared Vance lucky to be alive, after they'd moved him into the house and settled him in his bed, after the fire had burned down to smoldering coals and the first light of dawn was breaking over the mountains, that Thomas found the evidence, a kerosene can, empty, deliberately placed behind the barn where no one would normally go. The fire hadn't been an accident. Mara stood looking at the can in Thomas's hands, and she knew with absolute certainty who had set the blaze. Jasper Crane had made good on his threat. If he couldn't have her, he'd destroy everything she was building. He'd nearly killed Vance, nearly orphaned 4 children, nearly burned away the first real home she'd found in years. And he wasn't done yet. The sun rose on a scene of devastation. The barn reduced to blackened timber and ash. 3 traumatized horses huddled together in the paddock, and Vance Calder lying unconscious in his bed, the smell of smoke clinging to everything. Mara sat beside him, holding his blistered hand carefully in hers, watching his chest rise and fall. The children had finally fallen asleep in various locations around the house. Exhaustion overcoming fear. She'd been wrong, she realized. She'd thought running to Wyoming would be enough. She'd thought becoming part of a household would protect her. But Jasper had followed her across a continent. He'd committed arson. He'd nearly committed murder. And she knew, with cold certainty, that he wouldn't stop until she confronted him directly. Vance's eyes fluttered open. He looked at her, confusion clouding his features before memory returned. The horses? 3 survived. Storm. She couldn't finish. Pain flickered across his face, but he nodded. Thomas? Holding together. Barely. They all are. He tried to sit up, winced, fell back. The fire. Was it deliberate? Yes. We found the kerosene can. Vance's eyes darkened with understanding. Crane. I'm sorry, Mara whispered. I brought this to your door. I should never have. Don't. His hand tightened on hers despite the pain it must have caused. This isn't your fault. A man who'd burn a barn to make a point is capable of anything, which means... He stopped, coughing, his body racking with the effort. Dr. Morrison appeared in the doorway. That's enough talking, Vance. Your lungs need rest. Miss Leland, step outside for a moment. Mara obeyed reluctantly, moving to the kitchen where she found Thomas sitting at the table, still holding the kerosene can, staring at nothing. He tried to kill Pa, the boy said flatly. That man from Philadelphia. He tried to kill my father. I know. What are you going to do about it? The question hung in the air between them. What was she going to do? Run again? Let Jasper keep destroying everything she touched? Or finally, stand and fight? She looked at Thomas, at this brave boy who'd lost his mother and nearly lost his father, who'd welcomed her grudgingly but was trying so hard to trust her. I'm going to end this, she said quietly. One way or another, I'm going to make sure he can't hurt this family again. Thomas nodded slowly. Good. Tell me what you need. The morning sun climbed higher, indifferent to the devastation below. Mara stood in the yard surveying the wreckage of the barn, with Thomas beside her. Smoke still rose in lazy spirals from the collapsed timbers, and the acrid smell of burned wood hung thick in the air. The 3 surviving horses paced nervously in the paddock, their eyes still wide with the memory of terror. What's the plan? Thomas asked, his voice harder than any 12-year-old should be. Mara looked at the kerosene can still in his hands. First, we take that to Sheriff Dawson. Get it on record that this was arson. Then, she paused, the words difficult to form. Then I go talk to Jasper myself. You can't go alone. I have to. He won't listen to threats or reason from anyone else, but he needs to understand that I'm not running anymore, that I have people who'll stand with me now. Pa won't like this plan. Your pa is in no condition to argue. Mara's voice was gentle but firm. And by the time he's well enough to object, it'll be done. Thomas studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'm coming with you to town, at least. Someone needs to watch your back. She wanted to argue, to protect him from further involvement, but the set of his jaw told her it would be pointless. Besides, she understood the need he had, to do something, anything, to fight back against the man who'd hurt his family. All right, but you stay outside when I talk to him. Understood? Understood. They walked back to the house to find Grace making breakfast for the younger children, her movements mechanical, shock still evident in her eyes. Ruby sat at the table clutching her rag doll, unusually quiet. Daniel was nowhere to be seen. Where's your brother? Mara asked. Out by what's left of the barn, Grace said quietly, looking for Storm. Mara's heart clenched. Grace, you know Storm didn't. I know, but Daniel needs to look anyway. He needs to be sure. The wisdom in those words, coming from a 9-year-old, made Mara want to weep. These children had learned too young how to process loss, how to navigate grief. Now they were learning something even darker, that sometimes loss came not from accident or nature, but from deliberate human cruelty. She found Daniel standing at the edge of the burned remains, his small frame rigid with the effort of not crying. She came up beside him and put a hand on his shoulder. "I thought maybe he got out a different way," Daniel said, his voice thick. "Maybe he's just hiding somewhere, scared." "Maybe," Mara said gently, though they both knew it wasn't true. "But Daniel, even if Storm didn't make it, you need to remember something. Your father and I went into that fire trying to save him. We tried everything we could. Sometimes trying is all we can do." "Pa almost died trying to save Thomas's horse," Daniel's voice cracked. "What if he had died? What if you'd both died?" "But we didn't. We're here. This time." Daniel turned to look at her, and his eyes were too old, too knowing. "But that man, the one from Philadelphia, he'll try again, won't he? He'll keep trying until someone does die." The brutal honesty of childhood cut straight through any comfortable lie she might have offered. "Yes," Mara admitted. "He probably will, which is why I need to stop him today." "How?" "I'm not entirely sure yet, but I'm going to figure it out." Daniel nodded slowly, then surprised her by wrapping his arms around her waist in a fierce hug. "Don't let him hurt you too," he whispered. Mara held him tight, this boy who'd bounced with endless energy just yesterday, now trembling with fear for her safety. "I'll be careful. I promise." Inside, Dr. Morrison was checking on Vance, who was awake and clearly fighting the doctor's orders to stay in bed. "I don't care what you say, Morrison. Someone tried to burn down my barn. I need to—" He broke off coughing, the sound harsh and painful. "What you need to do," the doctor said firmly, "is rest. Your lungs are damaged, Vance. You breathed in enough smoke to kill a man. You're lucky to be alive. And if you don't let yourself heal properly, you won't stay that way." Vance's eyes found Mara in the doorway. "Did you find evidence? Was it deliberate?" "Yes. We found a kerosene can. I'm taking it to Sheriff Dawson. I'm coming with you." "No," Mara said quietly but firmly. "You're staying here. Your children need you alive more than they need you seeking revenge. This isn't about revenge. It's about protection. About—" More coughing interrupted him. "It's about me finishing what I should have finished in Philadelphia," Mara interrupted. "This is my fight, Vance. Let me fight it." Something in her tone must have reached him because he stopped arguing, though frustration was clear in every line of his body. "Then take Thomas and a rifle." "I'm taking Thomas. The rifle won't help. This needs to end with words, not bullets." Dr. Morrison looked between them, clearly sensing the layers of conflict he didn't fully understand. "I'll stay with the family while you're gone," he offered. "Make sure Vance doesn't do anything foolish." "I don't need a nursemaid," Vance growled. "You have 4 children and smoke-damaged lungs that could kill you if you're not careful," Morrison replied. "You absolutely need a nursemaid. Miss Leland, go do what you need to do. I'll keep everyone safe here." Mara met Vance's eyes one more time. So much passed between them in that look. Gratitude, fear, something deeper that neither was ready to name. Then she turned and walked out, Thomas falling into step beside her. The ride to town was tense and silent. Thomas had insisted on bringing his rifle despite Mara's objections about the gun not helping. Now it rested across his saddle, his hand never far from it. They'd saddled 2 of the surviving horses, both still skittish from the fire, their nervousness making the journey more difficult. Red Creek looked deceptively peaceful in the late morning light. People went about their business, unaware that in the night someone had committed arson 10 miles away. Mara and Thomas headed straight for Sheriff Dawson's office, a small building near the center of town. The sheriff was a weathered man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened to their account without interrupting, examining the kerosene can with professional interest. "And you think this Crane fellow did it?" he asked when they'd finished. "I know he did," Mara said. "He threatened me yesterday in the general store, said it wasn't over. He's staying at the hotel. Ask anyone. Check his room for kerosene. Question him about where he was last night. Dawson nodded slowly. I'll look into it. But Miss Leland, arson's a serious charge. If I arrest him without solid proof and it doesn't stick, he walks free and could sue for false imprisonment. I need to build a case carefully. Carefully might not be fast enough. He's already tried once. What's to stop him from trying again? The fact that he knows we're watching him now? Dawson stood, strapping on his gun belt. I'll go talk to him. In the meantime, you and the Calder family stay alert. Don't go anywhere alone. If he approaches you again, you come straight to me. Understood? It wasn't enough. Mara could feel it in her bones. Official channels would be too slow, too bound by rules that men like Jasper knew how to navigate. But she nodded anyway. Understood. They left the sheriff's office and stood in the street, Thomas clearly waiting for her next move. I need to find him, Mara said quietly. Need to talk to him before the sheriff does. Bad idea. Probably. But I'm doing it anyway. Thomas, go back to the ranch. Tell your father the sheriff's investigating. I told you I'm not leaving you alone. And I'm telling you that what I'm about to do, I need to do by myself. Please, Thomas, trust me. The boy's jaw worked, conflict clear on his young face. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. If you're not back by nightfall, I'm coming to find you. And I'm bringing every ranch hand in 3 counties with me. Fair enough. She watched him ride away, then turned toward the hotel. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her steps were steady. No more running, no more letting fear dictate her choices. The hotel clerk confirmed that Mr. Crane was in room 7, upstairs. Mara climbed the narrow staircase, her hand trailing along the banister, each step feeling both too fast and too slow. When she reached the door, she paused only a moment before knocking. Come in. His voice sent ice down her spine, but she opened the door anyway. Jasper sat in a chair by the window, reading a newspaper as if he hadn't just committed arson and attempted murder. He looked up as she entered, and his smile was the same pleasant mask he'd worn in Philadelphia, the one that had fooled so many people into thinking he was civilized. Mara, how unexpected. Please, sit. I'll stand. Suit yourself. He folded the newspaper carefully, deliberately. I assume you're here about the unfortunate fire. Terrible thing. I heard the rancher nearly died. You know he nearly died. You were there. You set the fire. That's quite an accusation. Do you have proof? The sheriff will find proof, but that's not why I'm here. Jasper's smile widened slightly. Then why are you here, my dear? To tell you that you've lost. Whatever game you thought you were playing, whatever point you thought you were making, you've lost. I'm not coming back to Philadelphia. I'm not going to be your mistress or your possession or whatever twisted thing you imagined. I'm staying here with people who actually value me, and there's nothing you can do to change that. He stood slowly, moving toward her with the deliberate grace of a predator. You think you can dismiss me so easily? After everything I did for you? You mean after all the ways you tried to control me? Mara held her ground as he approached. You never did anything for me, Jasper. You only did things to trap me, to make me dependent, to give yourself leverage. That's not generosity. That's manipulation. I loved you. The words came out harsh, almost desperate. I offered you everything, security, comfort, a place in my household, and you threw it back in my face like it meant nothing. Because it did mean nothing. You don't love me. You don't even know me. You just wanted to own something you couldn't have. Mara's voice remained steady, even as her hands trembled. And when I proved I wasn't for sale, you couldn't handle it. So you followed me across the country and tried to burn down the life I was building. That's not love, Jasper. That's obsession. That's sickness. His hand shot out, gripping her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. You belong to me. Say it. No. The slap came fast, snapping her head to the side, the sound sharp in the small room. Pain bloomed across her cheek, but Mara didn't cry out. She turned back to face him, tasting blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her mouth. That's all you have, isn't it? She said quietly. Violence, control, fear. You can't actually make someone care about you, so you try to break them into submission instead. I could have you arrested, Jasper hissed. Theft. You took items from my household when you left. A dress and some bread. Hardly a fortune. It's the principle. You stole from me. You owe me." The door burst open before Mara could respond. Sheriff Dawson stood there, his hand on his gun, 2 deputies behind him. "Step away from her, Mr. Crane." Jasper's hand dropped from Mara's face. His expression shifted instantly back to pleasant civility, as if the violence of moments before had never happened. "Sheriff, Miss Leland and I were just having a conversation." "Conversation that leaves bruises?" Dawson's eyes took in Mara's reddening cheek. "That's called assault where I come from. And funny thing, I just had a talk with the hotel stable boy. Said he saw you leave around midnight last night, came back a few hours later smelling of smoke. Care to explain that?" "I went for a ride." "Is that a crime?" "It is when combined with kerosene residue on your boots, which my deputy just finished examining while they were outside your door waiting to be cleaned. It is when combined with multiple witnesses who heard you threaten Miss Leland yesterday. And it's definitely a crime when it results in a burned barn and a man nearly dead from smoke inhalation." Jasper's pleasant mask cracked completely, fury blazing in his eyes. "She's mine. She owes me. I have every right." "You have no rights here," Dawson interrupted coldly. "Jasper Crane, I'm arresting you for arson and attempted murder. My deputies will escort you to the jail now." The deputies moved forward, producing handcuffs. Jasper fought them for a moment, his civilized veneer shattering completely as he hurled curses and threats. His eyes found Mara's one last time. "This isn't over. You think you're free? You'll never be free of me. Never." They dragged him out, still shouting. The door closed behind them, and suddenly the room was quiet except for Mara's ragged breathing. Her legs gave out, and she sat hard in the chair Jasper had vacated, her whole body starting to shake. Sheriff Dawson crouched in front of her, his expression gentler than she'd seen it. "You all right, Miss Leland?" "I will be." "That was either very brave or very foolish, coming here alone." "Probably both." Mara's laugh came out shaky. "But I needed him to show his true self to someone official. Needed you to see what he really is." "I saw it. The whole hotel probably heard it. Between the stable boy's testimony, the kerosene residue, and him assaulting you in front of a lawman, he's going away for a long time." Dawson stood, offering his hand to help her up. "Come on, let's get that cheek looked at, and then I'll escort you back to the ranch." "I need to stop by the general store first. Need to pick up supplies I didn't get yesterday when Jasper first grabbed her." The words caught in her throat. "I'll walk you there." "And Miss Leland? What you did just now, standing up to him, that took real courage. Not many people could do that." Mara touched her burning cheek gingerly. "I've spent too long being afraid of him. I couldn't let fear win anymore. Not when I finally have something worth fighting for." The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains by the time Mara rode back into the Calder ranch yard. Thomas must have been watching for her because he came running from the house before she'd even dismounted. "Pa's been pacing like a caged animal," he said, taking her horse's reins. "Drove Dr. Morrison half crazy. What happened?" "Jasper Crane's in jail, charged with arson and attempted murder. He won't be bothering us anymore." Thomas's eyes went to her bruised cheek, visible even in the fading light. "He hit you." "Yes, but he did it in front of the sheriff," which was the final piece of evidence needed to lock him away for good. "Did you let him hit you on purpose?" The question was shrewd, too knowing. Mara met his eyes steadily. "I went there knowing he might. Knowing that sometimes the only way to prove what someone really is to let them show it. But I also knew Sheriff Dawson would be coming. I wasn't as reckless as it might seem." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's still pretty brave. Or pretty crazy." "Definitely a bit of both." Mara managed a small smile. "How's your father?" "See for yourself." She entered the house to find Vance sitting at the kitchen table despite Dr. Morrison's clear disapproval. His face was still drawn with pain and exhaustion, but his eyes locked onto Mara the moment she appeared. He took in her bruised cheek in one swift glance, and his expression darkened. "He touched you." "It's over, Vance. He's in jail. The sheriff has evidence. He'll stand trial, and then—" Her voice caught, "and then he can't hurt anyone anymore." Vance pushed himself to his feet despite Morrison's protest, crossed the room in 3 strides, and pulled Mara into his arms. The embrace was careful of his injuries but fierce in its intensity. She stood frozen for a moment, surprised,
then let herself lean into him, let herself accept the comfort being offered.
You shouldn't have gone alone, he said against her hair. You should have waited for me. You were in no condition to help.
You could have died, Mara interrupted, pulling back to look at him. You nearly did die, Vance, and these children need you more than they need revenge or justice or whatever you think you should have done. So yes, I went alone, and yes, it was dangerous. But it's done now. They stood there, faces inches apart, so much passing between them that had nothing to do with words. Then Grace's voice broke the moment. Mara, your face is bleeding. Mara touched her cheek and her fingers came away red. The cut inside her mouth must have reopened. Dr. Morrison immediately went into professional mode, guiding her to sit while he examined the injury. Nothing serious, he pronounced. The bruise will fade in a few days, but you're lucky he didn't break anything.
The children had gathered around now. Daniel wide-eyed, Ruby clutching her doll, Grace hovering with worry, Thomas standing guard like a small soldier. Mara looked at their faces and felt something shift inside her chest, some final wall crumbling. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I'm sorry I brought danger to your home. I'm sorry your barn burned and Storm is gone and your father nearly died because of my past. It's not your fault, Grace said immediately. That man was evil. You didn't make him that way. Grace is right, Thomas added. You didn't set the fire. You ran into it. You saved Pa's life. Vance had returned to his chair, his breathing labored from the brief exertion. They're both right, and Mara... He waited until she looked at him. You're part of this family now, for better or worse. That means your fights are our fights. Your past is something we face together, not something you face alone. The words hit her like a physical blow. Family. He'd called her family. Ruby climbed into Mara's lap carefully, mindful of her injuries. You're not leaving, are you? Now that the bad man is gone? No, sweetheart. I'm not leaving. Promise? Mara wrapped her arms around the little girl. I promise. Dr. Morrison stayed for dinner, helping Mara cook since Vance was still in no condition to help, and the children were all hovering too close to be useful. They made a simple stew from what was available, the kitchen filled with quiet conversation and the ordinary sounds of a household coming back together after crisis. As the sun set and the doctor prepared to leave, he pulled Mara aside. That man, Calder. He cares about you. More than I think either of you realizes yet. Mara felt heat rise to her cheeks. We have an arrangement, a practical arrangement. Practical arrangements don't make a man run into burning buildings. They don't make him look at a woman the way he looks at you. Morrison smiled kindly. Just something to think about. After he left, Mara helped settle the children for bed. They were all clingy tonight, needing extra reassurance, extra time tucked in, extra promises that everything would be all right. Even Thomas lingered in the hallway when she finished with the younger ones, clearly wanting to talk but unsure how to start. Thank you, he said finally, for ending it, for making us safe again. You're welcome, though you helped too, you and your father both. This family protected me as much as I protected it. Thomas nodded, then surprised her by hugging her quickly before disappearing into his room. Mara stood in the hallway for a moment, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite name. When she returned to the kitchen, she found Vance still at the table, staring at his hands. The blisters were bandaged now, white cloth stark against his tanned skin. You should be resting, Mara said gently. I'll rest in a minute. Sit with me first? She sat across from him, the lamp between them casting shadows that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. I need to tell you something, Vance said, his voice rough from smoke damage but determined. When I saw that barn burning, when I knew the horses were trapped inside, all I could think about was losing everything again. The property, the animals, the means to provide for my children. It felt like Emma's death all over again, everything I'd built crumbling to ash. He paused, his jaw working. But then you ran in after me, into a burning building with no thought for your own safety. And I realized something in that moment when we were both choking on smoke and surrounded by fire. I realized that what I was afraid of losing wasn't the barn or the horses or even the ranch. It was you. Mara's breath caught. I don't know when it happened, Vance continued. Don't know when you stopped being just practical help and became He struggled for words, became essential, became someone I couldn't imagine this house without, someone I couldn't imagine my life without. Vance, let me finish. He reached across the table, his bandaged hand covering hers carefully. I know this isn't what we agreed to. I know it's not the practical arrangement we both thought we wanted, but I need you to know that what I feel, what I'm feeling, it's real. And if you don't feel the same way, that's all right. I'll honor our original agreement. But if there's any chance you might— I might, Mara whispered. I do. I mean— stopped, trying to organize thoughts that had been tumbling chaotically for weeks now. When I stood on that platform in front of the whole town, when everyone was laughing and no one wanted me, I thought I was accepting the very least I could hope for. A roof over my head, food in my belly, work to do. But you, this house, these children, it became so much more than that. It became home. And me? His voice was barely audible. What did I become? She met his eyes across the lamplight. You became the reason I want to stay. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because there's nowhere else I want to be. Vance stood slowly, came around the table to her side. He knelt beside her chair despite the pain it must have caused, bringing their faces level. I have something to ask you, he said. Something I should have asked properly from the start instead of just claiming you at an auction like livestock. He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small box. Inside was a simple gold ring, slightly worn, clearly old. This was Emma's ring, he said quietly. I've been keeping it safe for— I don't know what. Keeping it like keeping her memory alive somehow, but she wouldn't want it locked away in a box. She'd want it worn, loved, part of something living instead of something preserved. He took Mara's hand in his bandaged ones. Mara Leland, will you marry me? Not out of arrangement or necessity or practicality, but because I love you, because my children love you, because you make this house feel whole again. Will you be my wife truly in every sense of the word? Tears spilled down Mara's cheeks, hot and fast. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Vance slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Then he pulled her down from the chair and kissed her, gently because of his injuries, but with an intensity that made her heart race and her breath catch, and every nerve ending sing with joy. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying. Vance touched her bruised cheek carefully. I'm sorry, he said. Sorry I couldn't protect you from him sooner. You protected me in the ways that mattered. You gave me a home, a family, a reason to fight back instead of run. She covered his hand with hers. That's everything. They sat together on the floor, backs against the wall, Vance's arm around her shoulders despite his injuries, Mara's head resting against his chest, where she could hear his heart beating steady and strong. What happens now? She asked. Now we rebuild the barn, plan a wedding, keep living. Vance's voice rumbled through his chest. The simple, ordinary things that somehow feel miraculous when you're doing them with the right person. When should we tell the children? Tomorrow. Let them have one peaceful night first, though I suspect Thomas has already figured it out. Mara smiled. He's perceptive. He's had to be. They all have. Vance tightened his arm around her. But maybe now they can just be children again, now that we're not all just surviving anymore. They sat in comfortable silence until Vance's breathing grew heavy and Mara realized he'd fallen asleep, exhausted by the day's events and his injuries. She stayed still, not wanting to wake him, watching the lamp burn lower and thinking about everything that had changed since she'd stepped off that auction platform. She'd come to Wyoming expecting nothing, hoping for very little, believing she was worth exactly what she'd written in that letter. Not much. But Vance had seen differently. He'd looked past the worn dress and weathered face and saw someone worth choosing, worth defending, worth loving, and somehow, impossibly, she'd come to see herself through his eyes. Outside, the Wyoming night pressed close around the ranch. The barn lay in ruins, Storm was gone, and Jasper Crane sat in a jail cell awaiting trial. There would be challenges ahead, rebuilding, healing, facing whatever storms the frontier threw at them. But for the first time in her life, Mara wasn't facing those challenges alone. She was home. Morning light found them still there, Mara's back against the wall and Vance's head heavy on her shoulder, both having slept sitting up on the kitchen floor. The sound of small feet padding down the hallway woke Mara first. She opened her eyes to find Ruby standing in the doorway, her rag doll dangling from one hand, staring at them with wide, curious eyes. "Are you and Pa sleeping on the floor?" the little girl asked. Vance stirred, wincing as his injured body reminded him of yesterday's ordeal. "Ruby, what time is it?" "The sun came up," Ruby replied, as if that answered everything. Then her eyes caught on Mara's hand still resting on Vance's chest. "Mara has a ring, like the one in Pa's special box, yeah." Mara and Vance exchanged glances. So much for waiting until later to tell the children. "Come here, sweetheart," Vance said, his voice hoarse but gentle. Ruby padded over and climbed into his lap, careful of his bandaged hands. "That ring was your mama's. Now it's Mara's." Ruby processed this with the straightforward logic of a 4-year-old. "Does that mean Mara's going to be our new mama?" "If you'll have me," Mara said softly. "Your pa asked me to marry him last night." I said yes. Ruby studied Mara's face for a long moment, then turned to her father. "Will Mama in heaven be sad?" The question cut straight to the heart of everything they'd all been dancing around for weeks. Vance pulled his daughter close, his voice thick with emotion when he spoke. "No, baby. Your mama loved you all more than anything in the world. She'd want you to be happy. She'd want you to have someone to take care of you. And I think—" He glanced at Mara. "I think she'd be glad it's Mara." "Because Mara ran into the fire to save you?" "That's part of it, but mostly because Mara loves you. All of you. I can see it in everything she does." Ruby considered this, then nodded decisively. "Okay. I like having a new mama." She slid off Vance's lap and threw her arms around Mara's neck. "Can I call you Mama now?" Mara's throat tightened with emotion. "If you want to. Or you can keep calling me Mara. Whatever feels right to you." "I'll try both and see which one I like better," Ruby announced with the practical wisdom of childhood, then ran off to wake her siblings with the news. Vance struggled to his feet, Mara helping him up. They stood facing each other in the early morning light, both rumpled and sore, both changed irrevocably from who they'd been just weeks ago. "That went better than I expected," Vance said. "Ruby's young. The others might not—" But her words were cut off by the sound of running feet. Grace burst into the kitchen, her face alight with something Mara hadn't seen there before. Uncomplicated joy. "Ruby says you're getting married. Is it true?" "It's true," Vance confirmed. Grace launched herself at Mara, hugging her fiercely. "I'm so glad. I've been hoping, but I didn't want to say anything because Thomas said I shouldn't get my hopes up, but I'm so glad." Daniel appeared next, grinning widely. "Does this mean we can have a party? With cake?" "Eventually, yes," Mara laughed, "though we should probably rebuild the barn first." Thomas was last to emerge, moving more slowly than his siblings, his expression harder to read. He stood in the doorway taking in the scene, his father and Mara standing close, his sisters embracing Mara, Daniel already planning celebrations. "Thomas?" Vance's voice carried a note of concern. The boy's eyes went to the ring on Mara's finger, then to his father's face, then finally to Mara. "You're sure about this? About all of us? Because once you marry Pa, you can't just leave when things get hard. You'll be stuck with us." "Thomas?" Vance started, but Mara held up a hand. "He's right to ask." She moved toward Thomas, crouching to meet his eyes at his level. "You've been hurt before. You've lost people you loved. You've had people promise to stay and then leave. So yes, I understand why you need to be sure." She took his hand, the one that had helped her clear the garden, that had held the rifle to protect her, that had worked beside her day after day. "I'm sure, Thomas. I'm not going anywhere. Not when things get hard, not when you push me away because you're testing whether I mean it. Not ever. You're stuck with me now, and I'm stuck with you, and that's exactly how I want it." Thomas's eyes shimmered with tears he was trying hard not to shed. "You really mean that?" "I really mean that." He threw his arms around her neck, and she felt his thin shoulders shake with sobs he'd probably been holding back for 2 years. She held him while he cried. This boy who'd tried so hard to be a man, finally allowing himself to be a child again. When he pulled back, scrubbing at his eyes self-consciously, he looked at his father. "She's good for us, Pa. Better than I thought anyone could be."
"I know, son." Vance's voice was rough with emotion. "I know."
The morning proceeded with a chaotic energy that felt almost normal despite everything that had happened. Mara made breakfast while the children peppered her and Vance with questions about the wedding, about what would change, about whether Mara would sleep in Pa's room now or stay in the sewing room, about 100 other details that children found fascinating. After breakfast, Martha Hendricks arrived with her husband John, both of them having heard about the fire. They brought supplies, nails, lumber, tools, and John's offer to help rebuild the barn. "Heard about the arrest, too," Martha said, pulling Mara aside while the men discussed construction. "The whole town's talking about what that Crane fellow did. You're safe now, honey. He'll be in prison for years." "I know. It still doesn't feel quite real yet." "Give it time. Healing takes longer than hurting." Martha's eyes went to the ring on Mara's finger. "Well now, that's new." Mara felt herself blushing. "Vance proposed last night." "About time. Anyone with eyes could see how that man looks at you." Martha pulled her into a hug. "I'm happy for you both. You deserve this." Over the next few days, more neighbors arrived, ranchers and their families, people from town, even Mrs. Rowan, who came with her husband and offered an apology that seemed genuine if uncomfortable. "I was cruel to you," Camille Rowan said stiffly. "At the auction and at the festival, I had no right. And when I heard what that man did, trying to burn you out—" She paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come naturally. "I'm sorry. You've proven yourself to be exactly what this community needs, what Vance and his children needed." It wasn't a warm apology, but it was sincere. Mara accepted it with grace. "Thank you, Mrs. Rowan. That means a great deal." The barn raising became an event, neighbors working together in the frontier tradition of mutual aid. Men sawed and hammered, women brought food, children ran wild playing games between the adults' legs. The structure rose with surprising speed, not as grand as the original, but solid and functional, built with the collective effort of a community that had decided Mara was one of their own. Vance worked despite his injuries, though Mara and Dr. Morrison both scolded him for it. He was careful, limiting himself to lighter tasks, but he needed to be part of it, needed to help rebuild what Jasper Crane had tried to destroy. "Stubborn man," Mara muttered, watching him measure boards with Thomas. "That's why you love him," Grace said, appearing beside her with a basket of cornbread to distribute to the workers. Mara looked down at the 9-year-old, surprised by her perception. "When did you get so wise?" "I pay attention. Mama used to say that's the secret, paying attention to what people do, not just what they say." Grace smiled. "Pa does a lot. So do you. That's how I knew you'd be good for each other." The new barn was finished in 4 days, christened with a celebration that spilled into the evening. Someone brought a fiddle, another a guitar, and soon music filled the air. Children danced, adults talked and laughed, and for a few hours the trauma of the fire receded into something that had happened but didn't define them. Mara found herself pulled into a dance by Daniel, then by Grace, then by John Hendricks, who proclaimed her officially one of us now. When the music slowed, Vance appeared at her elbow. "May I?" he asked, offering his hand. They danced together under the stars, moving slowly because of his injuries, but with a rightness that made words unnecessary. Other couples joined them, the yard full of swaying figures, the new barn standing proud behind them. "Thank you," Vance said quietly. "For what?" "For staying, for fighting, for loving my children, for loving me." He pulled back to look at her. "For not quitting. I told you from the start, I don't quit. Best decision I ever made, claiming you at that auction. Best decision I ever made, letting you." They danced until the music ended and guests began departing, calling out congratulations and good wishes. The children helped clean up, then dragged themselves to bed, exhausted by days of excitement and emotion. Finally, Mara and Vance were alone in the kitchen again, the house quiet around them. "I've been thinking about the wedding," Vance said, "about when we should do it." "And?" "Soon, next week, if the Reverend can manage it. I don't want to wait anymore, Mara.
We've both waited long enough for happiness. She moved into his arms, careful of his healing hands. Next week sounds perfect. The wedding took place on a Sunday morning in the small church in Red Creek. Mara wore a new dress, pale blue, simple but beautiful, sewn by Martha Hendricks and 3 other women who'd insisted on contributing. Grace had woven wildflowers into Mara's hair, Ruby carried a small bouquet, and Thomas stood beside his father with visible pride. The church was packed. It seemed the entire town had turned out, curiosity and genuine goodwill drawing them together. Sheriff Dawson sat in the front row, having brought news that morning that Jasper Crane had been formally sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison for arson and assault. The news had lifted a weight from Mara's shoulders she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Reverend Matthews kept the ceremony brief, speaking about love and commitment and the building of families through choice as much as blood. When it came time for vows, Vance spoke them steadily, his eyes never leaving Mara's face. I, Vance Calder, take you, Mara Leland, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. Mara repeated the words, her voice clear despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Vance kissed her gently, and the church erupted in applause. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, tables set up in the yard, food enough to feed 3 times the number of guests present. Someone had brought a cake, Martha's doing, and Daniel's wish for a proper party had come spectacularly true. Mara moved through the crowd in a daze of happiness, accepting congratulations and well wishes, watching her new stepchildren play with other children, seeing Vance talk with neighboring ranchers about spring planting and livestock prices. Ordinary conversations about ordinary things, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. Everything felt touched with magic, with the impossible made possible. As the sun began setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Thomas appeared at her elbow. Ma, can I talk to you? They walked a little way from the party to the edge of the new garden where the vegetables were starting to come up in neat rows. Thomas pulled something from his pocket, a small wooden carving of a horse. I made this, he said, for Storm, to remember him by, but I want you to have it. Thomas, I can't. Please. You tried to save him. You almost died trying. That means something. He pressed the carving into her hands. Ma would have liked you. I wish she could have met you, but I think she'd be glad you're taking care of us now. Mara pulled him into a hug, this boy who'd fought so hard against accepting her and was now fighting just as hard to let her in. Thank you. I'll treasure this. When they returned to the party, Vance caught her eye across the crowd and smiled. A real smile, the kind that transformed his whole face and made her heart skip. She smiled back, thinking about the journey that had brought them here. The auction platform, the long ride to the ranch, the gradual building of trust, the fire, the fear, the fighting back. All of it had led to this moment, to this celebration, to this family. As darkness fell and guests began departing, the children presented their gift, a quilt they'd been secretly working on with Martha Hendricks's help. Each child had contributed a square with symbols representing their family. Thomas had stitched a barn, Grace had embroidered books, Daniel had added horses, Ruby had sewn a slightly lopsided house, and in the center, Martha had helped them add one more square, 2 hands clasped together, representing Vance and Mara's union. It's for your bed, Grace explained. So you know we're all together now, a real family. Mara couldn't speak around the lump in her throat. Vance pulled his children close, all of them wrapped in an embrace that finally felt complete. Later, much later, when the last guest had left and the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Mara and Vance stood on the porch looking out at their land. The new barn stood solid against the starlit sky. The garden showed the promise of future harvests. Everything they'd built together, everything they'd fought to protect. Do you ever think about that day? Vance asked. The auction? Sometimes. I think about standing there believing I was worth nothing, believing no one would choose me. I chose you. You did. And you changed everything. She leaned against him,
feeling his arm come around her shoulders. I came here expecting so little, just survival, just a roof and food and work to do. But you gave me so much more than that. We gave each other more than that, Vance corrected. You saved this family, Mara, not just from the fire, but from grief that was swallowing us whole. You brought life back to this house. Light. Hope. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. One of the horses whinnied softly in the barn. Ordinary night sounds of the frontier, but tonight they felt like a symphony. I should check on the children, Mara said eventually. They're fine. Thomas is old enough to handle anything that comes up. Vance turned her to face him. Tonight, let them be. Tonight is for us. He led her inside to the room they now shared, where the quilt his children had made was spread across the bed. They lay together in the darkness, talking quietly about plans for the future, about expanding the herd, about teaching Ruby her letters, about 100 small dreams that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with living. I love you, Vance said into the darkness.
I don't think I've said it enough. But I love you, Mara called her. The name still felt new, unfamiliar on her tongue when she replied, I love you too, more than I knew I could love anyone. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, and the quilt made with love, the house breathing peacefully around them. Autumn turned to winter, and winter melted into spring. The seasons changed as they always did, but the Calder household changed too, in ways both small and profound. Grace started writing her own stories, filling journals with tales of adventure and courage that Mara suspected were influenced by their own journey. Daniel learned to gentle the new horses they acquired, showing a natural gift for animal handling. Ruby started school, bringing home papers covered in careful letters for Mara to display proudly on the kitchen wall. And Thomas grew into himself, the weight of premature responsibility easing as he learned he didn't have to carry everything alone. He smiled more, laughed more, even teased his siblings with the casual cruelty of brotherly affection. Vance's hands healed, though the scars remained. He said they served as reminders of what they'd almost lost and what they'd fought to keep. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts, Mara's efficiency in managing the household freeing Vance to focus on the land and livestock. But more than the practical improvements, the house itself transformed. Laughter echoed through rooms that had been silent too long. Music played in the evenings when Grace practiced the small piano they'd purchased from a family moving back east. The smell of bread baking became a constant, comfortable presence. Mara opened her small bakery in town just as she dreamed, operating it 2 days a week while Vance managed the children. People came not out of pity or curiosity, but because her bread was genuinely good, her prices fair, and her smile warm. She became Mrs. Calder, the rancher's wife, not the leftover bride from the auction. The distinction mattered, though she tried not to dwell on it. One spring evening, almost a year after that fateful auction day, Mara found herself standing on the porch watching the sunset. Vance came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything. Nothing. How much has changed?" She covered his hands with hers. "Do you remember what you said that first night? That this wasn't a love match, just a practical arrangement?" "I remember being a fool," she laughed. "We both were. Both thinking we could keep our hearts safely locked away, just do the work and nothing more." "When did you know?" Vance asked. "When did you realize it was becoming more than practical?" Mara thought back, sifting through memories. "The festival? When you defended me to Mrs. Rowan? When you danced with me, even though you said you didn't dance anymore? That's when I started believing maybe I could be chosen for more than my cooking skills." "And when did believing become knowing?" "The fire. When I saw you unconscious in my arms and realized that losing you would break something in me that could never be repaired." She turned in his arms to face him. "What about you?" "The very first day," Vance admitted. "When you took over at the stove without being asked. When you tucked Ruby in and she actually went to sleep. When you looked at my children like they were people worth knowing, not just obligations to endure. I think I knew then, but I was too scared to admit it." "Scared of what?" "Scared of loving again, of losing again, of opening my heart just to have it shattered." He touched her face gently. "But you were worth the risk.
You've always been worth the risk." Behind them, the front door opened and closed.
"Are you two doing the mushy stuff again?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying clear disgust.
"It's time for dinner, and Thomas says if you don't come in soon, he's eating your portions." They laughed and turned toward the house, toward the light spilling from the windows, toward the sound of their children bickering good-naturedly over whose turn it was to set the table. Later that night, after dinner and dishes and the bedtime routine that had become so familiar it felt like breathing, Vance pulled out an old journal from a drawer in their bedroom. Mara recognized it. The leather-bound book he'd occasionally written in, the one where he'd kept his thoughts during the years after Emma's death. "I want to write something," he said. "Something final." He sat at the small desk by the window, the lamp casting golden light across the page as he wrote. When he finished, he read it aloud. "To whoever reads this years from now, perhaps my children or their children, know this. Love comes when you least expect it, and in forms you never imagined. The woman I was married to first taught me how to build a home. The woman I married second taught me how to rebuild a life. Mara came to us with nothing but courage and a determination not to quit. She stood on an auction platform while people laughed at her worth, and she didn't break. She walked into our lives and quietly, steadily, made everything better. Not by trying to replace what we'd lost, but by helping us build something new alongside it. She is not Emma's replacement. She is our new beginning. The house breathes again, the children laugh again, and I am no longer alone. If I've learned anything, it's that the heart's capacity for love is greater than we imagine, that healing doesn't mean forgetting, that choosing to open yourself to someone new isn't a betrayal of the past, but an honoring of it. To my children, your mother would have loved Mara. Of that I'm certain. She would have recognized the strength, the gentleness, the fierce determination to protect those she loves. She would have been glad. To Mara, if you're reading this after I'm gone, know that you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever, hope. You proved that even in the darkest times, even when everything seems lost, there's always the possibility of light, always the chance for a new beginning. Thank you for not quitting. Thank you for staying. Thank you for loving us. We are home because you made us home again." Vance set down the pen and closed the journal. Mara was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face in a release of joy and grief and gratitude all tangled together. "That was beautiful," she whispered. "It's true. Every word." He came to her, pulling her close. "You're the best thing that's happened to this family, Mara. The absolute best thing." They held each other in the lamplight, the journal closed on the desk, its words preserved for future generations who would read about the mail-order bride nobody wanted and the lonely rancher who saw her worth. Outside, Wyoming stretched vast and beautiful under its canopy of stars. The land they'd fought to keep, the home they'd built together, the future that spread before them full of ordinary miracles and extraordinary love. In the morning, there would be breakfast to make, and children to tend and work to do. There would be challenges and hardships because that was the nature of frontier life. But there would also be laughter and music, and the quiet satisfaction of building something lasting. Mara had arrived in Wyoming expecting nothing more than survival. Instead, she'd found everything that mattered: family, purpose, belonging, and a love she'd never believed she deserved. She'd stood on that platform convinced of her own worthlessness, and Vance Calder had stepped forward with 3 simple words that changed everything. "I'll take her." Not because he pitied her, not because she was all that was left, but because he saw in her what she was only beginning to see in herself: strength, resilience, and a heart brave enough to try again despite every reason to give up. Love hadn't come fast. It had come quietly, carefully, built day by day through shared work and shared grief and shared hope. And it had stayed for good. In the bedroom down the hall, Ruby stirred in her sleep, reaching for the rag doll she still carried everywhere. Grace's breathing was steady and peaceful, her dreams full of stories yet to be written. Daniel sprawled across his bed with the carelessness of childhood. And Thomas slept with one hand hanging off the side of his bed, finally relaxed enough to truly rest. 4 children who'd lost one mother and found another, who'd learned that family wasn't just about blood, but about choice, about the people who stayed when things got hard, about the love that built itself slowly, one meal and one tucked-in child, and one shared burden at a time. Mara extinguished the lamp and climbed into bed beside her husband. Tomorrow she'd wake early to start the bread. She'd pack lunches for the children's school. She'd work in the garden and tend to the chickens and probably break up at least one argument between siblings. She'd ride into town for her bakery day, greet the customers who'd become friends, and return home to a family that needed her as much as she needed them. It was an ordinary life, a simple life, the kind of life she'd never imagined she could have when she'd boarded that train in Philadelphia with nothing but a worn satchel and desperate hope. But it was hers, completely, wonderfully, impossibly hers. And as sleep claimed her, wrapped in her husband's arms and covered by the quilt his children had made, Mara Calder smiled into the darkness, grateful beyond words for the day she'd stood on that platform, and one man had seen past everything to the truth beneath. She was worth choosing, worth fighting for, worth loving. She always had been. She just needed someone brave enough to prove it.